Дойде време за поредното наистина голямо
Hello again.
литературно име сред участниците на
We
Софийския
are
международен
on
литературен
our
фестивал.
next really great
Това име е
name
Салман
among the
Ружди. В
participants
ръцете си държа
at the
последното
Literary
негова
Festival,
излязла
and
книга
his
на
name is
български език
Salman
в превод
Rushdie.
на
I
Надежда
have
Розова.
here in my
Очакваме
hands
следващата, която всъщност е
his
неговата
latest
най-скорошна.
book
Тя се
translated into
казва Кишот.
Bulgarian, and
Надяваме се, че
we
ще излезе в
expect
началото на
his
2021
next book,
година.
which is his most
А
recent book,
сега Салман
Kishot,
Ружди ще бъде наш
and we
гост.
hope
С
to
него
see
ще
it
разговаря
at the
Димитър
beginning
Kenarov
of
през
next
следващия
year.
един час.
Salman
Приятно
Rushdie
гледане.
will be our guest for the next hour.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Doing fine, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm pretty well, thank you. I'm in New York on a cold winter day.
Well, you know, one of the wonderful things about having to introduce Salman Rushdie to the Bulgarian audience is that, you know, I don't have to do a long intro because a lot of people have heard of Salman's and his books and have read his books. And plus, you know, who needs a long intro? We never like long intros in books or festivals. So I'm just going to say just a few words. And in fact, my personal connection to Salman's work began when I first went to the United States back in 2000 as a college student. And my very first class that I took in college was, I studied American literature there. And the very first class I took was Indian history through literature. And so we ended up reading, you know, books by British writers, of course, who have relation to India, like George Orwell or Ian Forster and Paul Scott. But also we read a lot of Indian writers writing in English, like Rian and Mira Sial and Jhumpal Lahiri, and of course Salman Rushdie. And we read your book, The Moor's Last Sigh. So to me, you know, that sort of first introduction to America through Indian literature in English, you know, speaks of the sort of a testament to really the influence of Indian writers, not only in America, but I think globally. And it's and the other thing, you know, that really strikes me, you know, about your work whenever I read it, and also about your life, is that, you know, there are many talented writers, but there are very few writers who have character as well, and who have been so fearless, and who have led this life, and who have led many fictional lives and many real lives, but who have managed to get through them, and to be able to do it with such courage and integrity. So it's really a great pleasure. It's an honor to speak to you today at this festival.
Oh, thank you.
And just to explain to the audience, the way we're going to do this tonight is we're going to speak about your latest book, Kishot, which is coming out, I think, in a few weeks, early January. In Bulgaria, it's translated by Nadezhda Rozova, who has translated some of your other books, including Fury, as we saw, and The Moor's Last Sigh, I think The Ground Beneath Her Feet as well. And so the way we're going to do this is I'm going to be asking you about the book, and we're going to use the characters or situations in the book to sort of as a springboard to talk about other issues as well.
Okay, sure.
But before I begin, Salman, I would like to ask you, I know it's not a good thing to ask a personal question, but I'm going to ask you that first. What was 2020 like for you?
Oh,
Professionally and personally?
well, I mean, personally, I mean, you know, it was like it has been for everybody. You know, it's been a very hard year. I actually I had the coronavirus. I got the illness quite early in March, and fortunately, I did not have the worst of it. So I was not in hospital, but I was sick for 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, until the beginning of April. And since then, fortunately, I've been quite well. So that was my personal drama, was to get the illness almost at the very beginning, you know, of this saga. And then, I mean, living in New York in these years, in these months has been, in the United States, has been horrifying because of not just because of the spread of the illness, but also the kind of the attitude of the current US administration, which has been essentially to do nothing. And you feel that tens of thousands of people who have died need not have died if there had been a different approach taken to the illness. So that's been very sad. Professionally, for a long time, I found it difficult to write, actually. I mean, for a long time this year, a lot of people would say, oh, well, now that everything's quiet and you have to stay home, it's a good time to be a writer, but actually that was not my experience. I found it hard to write in the middle of this tragedy. And I started writing a couple of things which then I abandoned, I set aside because they just seemed not to be right, And what I have done, the one thing that I've written this year, which is a very strange thing to have done, is I've written, for the first time in my life, I've written a play. And to write a play at the moment when every theater in the world is closed is stupid, right? So, that's what I find. That's what I've done. So now we have to see. Maybe one day the theaters will be open and somebody will want to put on the play. So,
yeah. But
so
I'm not surprised because you do have an interest in acting, and you've always had an interest in acting.
Yes.
So I think that's a sort of a natural outgrowth of your work.
Well, I think I was surprised. In a way, I'm surprised that it has taken me so long to write I've collaborated twice with adaptations of novels of mine for the stage. Haroun and the Sea of Stories and Midnight's Children were both done on the stage in England and America. And I was involved in that, but this is the first time I've written an original work for the stage. And we'll see, I mean, hopefully the world will reopen soon.
Yeah, we'll hope so. So let's jump to the book. And I want to ask you, I mean, this is the first modern novel, Don Quixote. Mm-hmm. And you've written a book called Quixote. You've used the French for Quixote. Could you tell me a little bit about the origins of your book and how it all started?
Well, it started from about 2 or 3 different directions that came together. One was that I've written now 2 or 3 previous novels which are primarily set in the United States, but most of them were set in New York City and not in on any larger canvas. And what I thought is, now I've been living here for more than 20 years. And I felt that I was ready to attempt some bigger canvas, some book that attempted not just to write about my neighborhood, but tried to take a look at the country, and not just the bits of the country that I agree with, not just the kind of liberal East Coast, West Coast, Democrat areas, but also the middle of the country, which is very different. So I had this idea of writing some kind of a book which would contain a journey. And at one point, I even thought it might be a nonfiction book. I thought I might take the journey and see what happened. But then I thought, no, really, I want to make it up. I don't want to deprive myself of imagination. So it turned into it. And then, as a coincidence, I'm talking about 4 or 5 years ago when I was thinking this. And by a coincidence, I was asked if I would write something about Cervantes, because it was the 400th anniversary of Cervantes and Shakespeare. And so I picked up Don Quixote for the first time in a long time. And I suddenly thought, well, okay, this is going to help me, to write the kind of book I want to write. And so it happened like that. These 2 things came together. And I had been thinking about other books as well, other journey books as well. For example, Voltaire's novel Candide, which is another kind of journey about an innocent person traveling across a terrible landscape, so I think that there was a whole bunch of things that came together eventually. And then I thought quite rapidly, my characters, like my Quixote, my Sancho, kind of stopped being like Cervantes's characters. You know, they became mine, became different. So yes, I mean, Cervantes, of course, is the giant figure that stands behind the book, you know, but in the end, the book kind of went on its own journey. It went on a journey which is about America. It's also about a father and a son trying to make a better relationship with each other. It's and you know, it's about love and death and opioid crises and all sorts of things. It's a, you know, I like the books. The books I like as a reader are books which try to take a very big armful of the world, you know, and try and pull it all into the book. You know, I mean, Charles Dickens, that kind of writer, you know, and so this is kind of an everything book. It's a book that tries to be about everything.
Yeah, you didn't do the Borges thing of Pierre Menard.
No, although I love the Borges story of Pierre Menard's Don Quixote is a beautiful story, like, but that's not my way.
Yeah. Perhaps I have to tell our listeners here that sort of the kernel of the book is about an elderly traveling salesman whose mind is addled by TV shows and various kinds of, all kinds of TV shows. He watches absolutely everything, and he decides that he's in love with a girl whose name is surprisingly or unsurprisingly Salma R. Yeah. And he falls in love with her, and he tries to win her heart. And he goes on a journey across America to be able to get to her. And on the way, he invents a child for himself, a son, 15-year-old called Sancho, who's in black and white at first, but he gradually acquires more solidity. And so they end up going on that journey together to find Salma R. Now, I wanted to ask you something about reality shows, because I remember there is an essay I read by you back, I think 20 years ago in 2001, which was about reality shows. And I'm quoting there, you're saying that these are people becoming famous for doing nothing much at all. And in that essay, you were predicting that the reality shows won't have a long shelf life, that they will disappear from our media environment pretty quickly. I want to ask you, two questions. First, why do you think they have stuck around so long? And my other question is, did you have to watch a lot of reality shows for your research?
I think the answer to the second question is yes, I did. And now I don't have to. So that's one of the good things about having finished the book. I think they've stuck around for a number of reasons. One is that they're very cheap to make. They're much cheaper to make than a movie or a drama. And because we live in an age which is kind of obsessed by instant celebrity, so this is a way in which kind of ordinary people can turn into famous people, and that's attractive. It's attractive to a lot of people. And I was just thinking that in the way that Cervantes attacked the kind of chivalric literature of his time and said that it literally drove his character mad. Don Quixote has been driven mad by reading too many of these awful books. And I thought, well, what would drive people mad now? And I thought maybe it would be reality television. And having watched a lot of it, I could feel it having a very bad effect on my mind.
But it seems also that the way those chivalric romances were sort of a little bit antiquated for the Cervantes period, there is also something a little antiquated about watching TV as well, isn't there? People now are on social media, or they watch Netflix, or
everything is streaming.
The very idea.
Yeah, everything is streaming. But also just this, in the particular group of shows that the book talks about is these kind of romance shows, where people have competitions to win somebody's heart, and first of all, just the idea that love is a competition, is sort of silly, and these shows are very old-fashioned in many ways, that people have to in some formal way woo each other, but through a series of competitions. So I found them very funny. I thought they were, but they're not intentionally funny. They're unintentionally funny. But actually, the pleasure I had from watching them was that they actually made me laugh a lot, but not because they were trying to. They were very serious about what they were doing.
Yeah.
But the effect of it was funny, and that actually gave me a clue about the tone of voice for the book, because I wanted the book to be funny. Even though it's about quite serious things in many ways.
It is very funny. Yeah.
Yeah, I think black comedy is a difficult thing to do. If you do it wrong, then it trivializes the subject. And if you do it right, then it doesn't. Then the subject retains its seriousness, but it acquires an extra dimension of humanity because it makes you laugh.
Yeah. It's interesting though that in Don Quixote, for example, he goes to the land when he travels among normal people. But our moment in time is a little different. And as to quote the Wizard of Oz, to quote Dorothy, Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah.
And it seems that fiction has bleeded into our reality, that fiction has usurped. Things are so strange. Things have become so strange in our everyday reality. They have, as you say, the age when anything can happen. That what happens, I want to ask you, what happens to fiction when politics and everyday life has usurped that kind of strangeness, that kind of fictional magical thing? How can fiction top that, and what is the road for fiction in that context?
It's a fair question. It's a real question, because the world has become stranger than anything that you can make up, and I think I would have two answers to that. One is a sort of technical answer. What I felt in this book is that because the world is so bizarre, that it's impossible to write about it in a conventionally realistic way, because the world somehow has stopped being conventionally realistic. It's become a kind of surrealism. So the question is, how can you find in a book a mirror for that? How can you find a sort of surrealism which feels like the world? And strangely, I thought that the surreal, the fabulous, the fantastic, the absurdist, all these methods are now more truthful than naturalism, because the world has stopped being naturalistic. So that's one thing that I tried to do in the book, was to use all these other techniques, not as a way of escaping from reality, but as a way of describing it. To say that actually the world is now like this. There are towns in which people turn into pink elephants. This is not unusual anymore.
There is a scene in your book where, when your characters go through New Jersey,
yes,
and the town of Beringer, I think, where they see everybody turning into mastodons.
Mastodons, yeah. Well, this came from, it's no secret to say that this comes as a kind of homage to Eugene Ionesco's play Rhinoceros, which is a play about, in a way, it's a play about Nazism. It's a play about how your next door neighbors can suddenly turn into monsters, and can suddenly become so alien from you that they seem monstrous, And I began to think in these last years in America that maybe some kind of version of that is happening again. You know, that the rift in the society is so deep that we begin to seem like monsters to each other, like freaks, you know, like people that we can't communicate with. You know, and so I used a kind of version of Ionesco's idea to try and express that. You know, and that's what I'm saying, that the world is now like this. I mean, the other thing that I wanted to say is that, yes, we do live in a time in which, you know, we are beset by falsehoods, by, you know, by untruth, often used by the news media or by politicians or by whoever it may be, you know. And I think, oddly, fiction has a valuable place in counteracting that, you know, because fiction, even though it's made up, is actually about the truth. You know, the reason we write novels is to try and express some truth about human beings and about our societies and about how we are with each other and what we do to each other and why, you know. So whatever may be the technique of fiction, the purpose of fiction is the truth, you know, whereas the purpose of lies is to obscure the truth, you know. So in some way, fiction and lies are in opposition to each other, you know, and this may be a value, you know. And I think it's if we look back in history, if we look back at any time of authoritarian rule, fiction becomes a target precisely because it offers a different version of the truth than the official version, you know. And when the official version is trying to impose itself, you know, literature becomes a kind of enemy to that.
Yeah, no, certainly. And then there is this this thing, though, that you know, maybe it is the new kind of censorship where writers are not silenced anymore, but they're silenced through noise, through ambient noise. That is, we have a kernel of truth, and if the 20th century idea of censorship was like what happened to you with the fatwa of, you know, kill the writer, silence the writer, silence, you know, physically people who oppose these kinds of regimes, or who, you know, somebody's imagination are blasphemous or so on. But today it seems to me that the way truth is silenced is by this overwhelming amount of information, that noise. And how do we get around this?
Well, I think this is the big question. I think, in terms of media, I think this is the big question of our time, that we've created this way of communicating, you know, the internet, which makes many things, makes this conversation possible, for example, you know. So it obviously has great benefits in terms of communication, but it also has great dangers because, as you say, there's a cacophony of noise, and the valuable stuff can be submerged beneath this kind of torrent of disinformation and misinformation, you know. And I think this is something we all have to wrestle with, you know, because it really is a thing which can endanger free societies. It can, because if you erode people's belief in the truth, you do something very damaging to this fabric of a society, and it makes possible the emergence of leaders who say, I am the truth, follow me, you know, and that can replace the truth. And I mean, here in the United States, we came very close to that. Very close to that, because that's exactly what the phenomenon of Trumpism is about. It's about eroding the belief in the truth and saying simply, believe me, I'm the only person telling you the truth. And as we see, 70 million people voted for that. I mean, fortunately, 80 million people voted against it. So we're fortunate.
Yeah, it was close though. It was pretty scary, I have to say, when I was watching it. I want to go back to the book and to the road narrative you're talking about, because it seems there are several other. How should I say? This road narrative is not only a journey across America. but it's also a journey across literature and literary genres, and your own influences, so to speak, or the books that you've always liked. And to me, and I think you mentioned at one time Robert Persic's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is an extremely famous book in Bulgaria, in fact. A lot of teenagers read it. But also there is a book there, sort of, which I haven't, I've watched several interviews with you, and I have not heard anybody mention it. And to me, that book is Lolita.
Yes.
And I was wondering, because there's so many things. Like, for example, when your characters visit a town, it will be always in parentheses the population number, and of course the travel to different motels, and your obsession with American pop culture, which was also Nabokov's obsession in a way. There are little echoes of when somebody mishears something that is being said that is exactly like in Lolita. And I wanted to ask you, how much were you thinking about it when you were writing that book?
No, I mean, the answer is yes, I really was thinking about it, because I actually think that central section of Lolita, in which Humbert and Lolita are traveling across America. I mean, he's running away with her. And they go through this whole landscape of terrible motels and cafes and the kind of detritus of America, and his attempt to seduce this girl is against the background of that absolutely tawdry kind of anti-culture, and Nabokov does it wonderfully well, wonderful, as if he had been an American writer all his life. And not a recent arrival, and I love it. I think that's for me the strongest part of the book, and so yes, I was thinking about Lolita. A lot of people have suggested to me that maybe I was thinking about Jack Kerouac and On the Road, but actually, truthfully, I wasn't thinking about that very much.
It's more of a nameless journey with
exactly,
Kerouac, I think.
Exactly, that it has no purpose, whereas, Lolita has a kind of evil purpose, or at least Humbert has an evil purpose on his journey, but he has a purpose, and my character has a slightly nobler purpose, which is love, even if it's an impossible love, because, as you said, he's fallen in love with this woman on TV, who is, famous and young and beautiful and completely unattainable, by him as this sort of broken down old man. But he has the quality I really wanted him to have was this quality of immense optimism, that he believes all the way through that, love will find a way. And
he's not much of a knight of a dolorous visage.
No,
exactly. Visage.
Exactly. No, yeah, exactly. Cervantes's Don Quixote has a sad face. Mine is very cheerful, and I wanted that cheerfulness to be set against the context of a country, a landscape, which is not maybe the country not going through its most cheerful moment, but to have that contrast between the world that he's in and his approach to the world. I wanted that to be somewhere near the heart of the book. But yes, Nabokov for sure, yeah. And another book that was part of my landscape writing the book is of course Pinocchio. Carlo Collodi's, not Walt Disney's Pinocchio, but Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio, the original novel, which is why there's a talking cricket in the book and the talking cricket speaks in Italian.
Yes, yes, I love that part. And of course, the invented boy and the
yes, because that's again, Pinocchio is about a child that is brought into being simply by the father's desperate need for a child, and so that's also happens in my book, and in both cases, Pinocchio, the wooden puppet, wants to be real. He's very invested in the idea of being real, you know, and my Sancho is also obsessed with the idea of having a real life, you know, and so here's this book which is in a way about the crumbling of the idea of the real, you know, the way in which our sense of the real has decayed, you know, and so the most fictional character in the book, the character that is invented by one of the other characters, is the one that is most invested in the idea of the real, and that paradox was something that I liked.
Yeah. There is mentioning you know, levels of reality. What I also noticed about your book is there is you know, like there, you know, for our listeners, there is actually a second story which which is about, with two characters, mostly brother and sister, and brother is the author of Quixote.
Yes.
And so there is a sort of a metafictional element here, which you know, most of your books they are metamorphic, and they move from you know from reality into fiction and back again. But it seems to me that this is sort of a new attempt for you to use the metafictional genre. Could you talk a little bit about?
Yes, I've never done it. In fact, the truth is that in the past I slightly disapproved of it. You know, I didn't like the idea of writing a book about somebody writing a book. You know,
although you're a big Calvino fan. Yeah,
but I never did it before. I never had a book in which there's a writer writing a story, which is also the story that you read. And it was not part of my original design for this book either. It sort of showed up. I mean, it showed up on my computer, and I was kind of taken by surprise. I thought, what is this doing here? And it took me a while to even decide to keep it in the book, and to decide what role it would play in the book. This story about the imaginary writer who was writing the story that you're reading. Mm-hmm. And in the end, the reason I kept it was, well, first of all, I became very fond of the characters in that storyline. Particularly the female character who's known as Sister became, for me, a powerful character in the book. But also because I thought it would allow me to talk about, if you like, the journey from personal experience to the finished work. You know, that yes, the book can begin in some personal experience of the writer, but by the time it is translated into sentences on a page, it has become something else. You know, it's changed.
And everybody's asking you how much of it is real. Exactly.
Whereas actually the answer is it can start in reality, but by the time it's done, it has almost no relationship to real life. You know, and that journey from personal experience to the page is what I would call the act of imagination. You know, that's the act of creation. And so this became for me in the book a way of talking about the nature of the act of creation. So that, for example, in both stories, in the life of the so-called author, you know, he is having a kind of midlife crisis. He has a difficult relationship with a sister. He has a problematic relationship with a child. And in the book that he's making, the Quixote story, all those things are there, you know, versions of them, but they're not the same. They don't go the same way, you know. In some cases, they're more optimistic. They end up in a better place than in real life. And sometimes the other way around, you know. So I wanted to say, yes, here's his life and he's using his life. But the story he's making is not just an autobiography. It's a new thing. It's a new thing. And that's a work of art. That's what art tries to do. It tries to start from somewhere personal and then become something, if you like, better than that.
Certainly, to me, that was also a big part of the book, is to follow how much the two narratives, the narrative of the author and his relation of brother and his relationship with his sister, would diverge from the narrative that he creates of Quixote and the trampoline. I won't reveal who the trampoline is, but let the readers do the work. But yeah, it was fascinating, because I don't think I've seen that. I don't remember seeing that in books to so closely understand how much of the author's work goes into the actual work of art, and how it is changed. So to me, that process was certainly fascinating.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I want to ask you, since you mentioned Pinocchio, you've written children's books as well, or some people, let's say Harun and the Sea of Stories.
Yes.
Also, adults read it as well. But you've had an interest in children's literature. You wrote also Luca and the Fire of Life for your other son.
Yes.
And you've oftentimes talked about the influence of books like Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, or Alice in Wonderland. Could you talk a little bit more, about your understanding of children's literature and its function and place?
Well, one of the things these days, you see, children's literature, a lot of the best children's literature now is very, very naturalistic. It's very realistic, and it takes on very tough subjects. It takes on subjects of delinquency and addiction and crime and orphaning, and a whole series of things which sadly children in today's world have to face up to. And I think children's literature now is actually doing a very good job of enabling younger readers to face quite difficult things, in a way that it's still interesting to them to read, but I guess the children's literature that I've talked about is more fantastic than that. And I think it's because I came from, growing up in India, you have this enormous storehouse of fantastic tales available to you, from ancient times, and if you grow up with that being your first literary context, the Arabian Nights, the animal fables of the Panchatantra, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, all these texts. If that's your first experience of literature, which it was, for me, then you're very attracted to Western literature, which uses some of the same techniques, and so yes, I thought that the two Alice books by Lewis Carroll I still think of them as wonderful books. They also are books which cross the borderline between children and adult. I think you can read those books as an adult and get a different kind of pleasure from them than a child would. And that really is what I ended up wanting to do. And again, I've been always very interested in movies, and one of the things I thought is that there are movies in which you don't ask yourself if it's a children's movie or an adult movie. Who is Star Wars for? It's for everybody. Who is The Wizard of Oz for? It's for everybody. So the cinema has found a language which can appeal equally to young people and adults. And I thought there must be some way of finding a language on the page which can do that. And the Alice books were a kind of guideline for me, on how you might be able to do that. And so the two books that I wrote for my sons, Harun and the Sea of Stories, as you mentioned, and Luca and the Fire of Life, that was my project, was to find a book that they would enjoy as young people when they were 10, 11 years old, And then I thought maybe when they grow up and are adults and they read it again, they read it in a different way, So, I'm very happy that that's more or less what seems to have happened, that those two books appeal more or less equally to younger readers and grown-up readers, that's, for my mind, that's a great, for me, was a great success of those books, because it wasn't easy. I found myself, when I started writing Harun and the Sea of Stories, the problem of the tone of voice was a big problem, that I would write a passage and it would seem too adult, and children weren't like this, and then I would write another passage and it would seem too childlike. I thought grown-ups weren't like this, and trying to find exactly that voice which navigates between those two worlds and is appealing to both, was the question of writing. And again, the thing that helped me was the literature of the fable, You know, the fable exists in every language, in every culture. Right? And one of the great things about the fable is that it characteristically, it uses very simple language, but it can talk about very complicated things. You know, and that was for me the key, you know, to keep that the language should be not complex, you know, and it should be lighthearted and accessible. But through that, one could talk about serious things, you know, and that's what I tried to do in those two books.
Well, Alice, in a sense, is the opposite of Don Quixote, right? It's a normal girl going to La La Land. And,
yes, the thing I love about Alice, the character of Alice in those books, is that she is very opinionated. She has a very strong opinion about it. She's in this world, she doesn't even know what size the world is, or anything about it. But she's always scolding people all the way through the book. She's telling people off. She's saying, you don't do that. Don't behave like this. Do this. Don't be like that. And I thought, this is a real girl. You know, this is not just some standard issue, small blonde person. This is actually a real person because she has a real character. You know, and I love that about her, that she's so idiosyncratic. You know, she's not a conventional heroine. She's very bossy. She tells people off all the time.
And of course, the linguistic legerdemain of the magical sort of language. I mean, that's why Nabokov translated it into Russian, because he was the man to do it.
He was perfect for it. No, and it is the language of those two books is just magical. I mean, really is beautiful. They're so beautifully written. That's, I think, where the adult appreciation of those books comes in. Yeah. I mean, children love the story is beautiful and it's great fun and so on. And the drawings, the illustrations are wonderful. But for a grown-up, the absolute brilliance of the language is what captures you.
Yes, certainly.
You know? Yeah.
Well, there is also another interest I see in Quixote, and this is, I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's science fiction.
Yes.
And I know you've been interested in science fiction for a long time.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about it, and
yes.
and what do you see the value of science fiction? I mean, it's interesting. I'll just give you a bit of context that, you know, even in the States, if it was a niche kind of interest, science fiction, in Bulgaria during the communist period, a lot of people read science fiction. It was a mainstream interest. And the reason, you know, everybody's got the Galactica, you know, small sort of pocket books in their libraries. Mm-hmm. And the reason, you know, one of the reasons, at least I think, that people read them so much is that you could talk about politics and about the current situation through allegory, really, or through a different world. Of course, you'd have the regular Marxist sort of introduction that tells you that this is a, you know, critique of capitalism and so on and so forth. Yeah. But you could always read it against your own government as well, and that's why it was such a popular thing, you know. And you know, Clifford Simak, for example, was a big
is that right?
You know, cemetery world and the highway of eternity and so on. Yes. But yeah, talk to me a little bit about science fiction.
Well, I think that's exactly right. That science fiction is all, even in this. I mean, Clifford Simak, back in the what is now considered to be like the so-called golden age of science fiction, in like the 50s and 60s. So many writers, Simak and James Blish and Frederick Pohl and of course Isaac Asimov and so on, they discovered that science fiction is a wonderful vehicle for the exploration of ideas. You know, so I'd like, you know, Margaret Atwood has a nice. Instead of calling it science fiction, she calls it speculative fiction. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think that's a good term because it's a form in which one can be speculative, you know, about the world as it is, about the world as it might be. And yes, it can use allegory and it's very powerful for the use of allegory. You know? And so when I was a teenager in the 60s, I became kind of obsessed by science fiction and I read really a lot of it. really a lot. I mean, of course, the great famous writers like Ray Bradbury and Kurt Vonnegut and Isaac Asimov and so on, but also the less famous hardcore science fiction writers. I mean, like in America, and in England, there were these magazines called things like Astounding or Amazing. Those were the names of the magazines. And I would read those. Then for a while, I stopped reading. And partly because I began to feel that in many of these stories, the actual quality of writing was not very high. And that in many cases, the female characters were weak. It was a very masculine form in those days. Now it's not like that. Now there's a lot of wonderful science fiction being written by women writers, like Margaret Atwood, like Ursula Le Guin, like Octavia Butler. I mean, there's a whole range of people, and so I stopped reading it for a time, and then more recently I became interested in it again. And for me, writing this novel, Quichotte, there was a moment at which I understood that to make the book finally satisfying to the reader, these two storylines that you were mentioning, they have to somehow come together. By the end of the book, they have to somehow come together, and the reader should have the satisfaction of thinking, oh, well, it's been the same story all the time, and now I see how it is. And for a long time, I didn't know how to do that. I knew that I should do it, but I was not clear how to do it. And then a couple of science fiction stories that I had probably not thought about for 50 years, came back into my head and showed me how to do it. Mm-hmm. In particular, a short story that was also done as a TV movie called Pictures Don't Lie, by a writer called Catherine MacLean, who actually passed away only a few months ago. Anyway, without spoiling the book for the readers, there was a thing about that story which showed me how to bring my book to a conclusion. And so it's very strange that this story, which I must have been 15 years old when I read it, 16 maybe, and I hadn't really thought about it since then, suddenly came into my head and showed me the ending of this novel. And I think this is one of the extraordinary things about being a reader as well as a writer, that things that have been in your mind for most of your life can suddenly show you something that you need to see. They can come out of some attic of your head, and help you. And this novel actually, in its final act, let's say, it becomes more and more of a science fiction novel. I mean, the kind of final act is a sort of science fiction act.
We won't reveal too much.
Yeah, but it sort of there's a part of it that is a picaresque novel. There's a part of it that's a surreal novel. There's a part of it that's absurdist, and finally it becomes a science fiction novel. There's a part of it that's a spy novel. It goes through a lot of changes, this book. But where it ends up is science fiction. And as I say, I was helped. At this age, when in my 70s, I was helped to finish a book by things that I had read as a teenager. So this is the strange business of writing books.
It is a beautiful ending, and as I said, we won't reveal too much so that the reader can keep on reading. But I wanted to ask you here, since you use so many literary references, intertextuality, and so on, in an age when obviously cultural knowledge is falling apart, it's being fragmented, how does a writer like you, who relies on layers and layers of intertextual references that are not necessary to catch in order to enjoy the book, but they are part of the book, they deepen the book for the reader. How do you deal with that aspect? I mean, it's not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for decades, but it has accelerated recently.
I mean, my view is those things are there if you see them, and they're not there if you don't. The thing is, I often use the metaphor of cooking. That when you put a lot of things into a stew, it's not necessary for the person eating it to be able to identify every single thing that you've put in. They have to decide if it tastes good or not. You know? And if it tastes good, then that's fine. You know, and if somebody is more of a foodie than that, then they can say, "Oh, I see, you've put in a little bit of this, I can taste a little bit of that." So somebody who has a more sensitive palate can discern the things that the chef has put into the food. But the ordinary eater just wants to know if it tastes good or not. and I think it's much the same with the book, you know, that if you have a certain general knowledge of other books and so on, and you can pick up resonances and echoes and borrowings and all that, then that becomes a part of your pleasure, you know. But for the general reader, the question is, are they having a good time? You know, does the story entertain them? Do they like the characters? Do they enjoy the way it's written? Do they like how it comes out in the end? You know, I mean, that's how we all read.
Of course.
I mean, look, if I read now, if we read, let's say, Anna Karenina, you know, there's going to be a lot of things that we miss, which are contemporary references that Tolstoy makes to even to like a cafe over here, or a certain kind of singer over there, or, you know, I mean, Tolstoy's books are full of contemporary references, which now either you have to look at footnotes, you know, or you don't get those in the way that contemporary readers would have, you know. But Anna Karenina is still Anna Karenina, you know. It still gives its readers an enormous amount. So the question is, are you getting enough? You know, and if you're getting enough, then you're getting enough. You don't have to pick up every nuance.
Yeah, of course. One more question, maybe, and then let's see. Maybe we have to open it up to the questions from the audience. But my question is the following, Salman. It's about Salma R.
Oh, yes.
She has gone through a lot. She was born in India. She moved to the United States. She was an actress there. Yeah. She moved to Hollywood, and then she became a TV personality. And a lot of your characters, like yourself in a certain way, are people who move between cultures, between countries, between continents, who recognize no frontiers, or actually, you know, either they feel at home everywhere or homeless. Mm-hmm. And your literature and your books themselves have functioned in that way, sort of cross-cultural, transnational kind of settings and ideas. How does this kind of literature function today, and characters, in a world that's increasingly closing down, that's increasingly, raising more borders, that is increasingly more nationalistic, and that sort of rejects that sort of free, no frontier movement? How does that affect a writer like you and characters like yours?
Well, to put it simply, my books are the enemy of that kind of attitude. You know, I mean, that's to say, I've been either in a minority or an immigrant all my life. You know, I mean, first growing up in India, I was not a part of the Hindu majority, so I was in a minority community there. Then I've been an immigrant twice, first from India into England, and then from England into America. So for me, the phenomenon of migration, the experience of migration, and of being in a minority community, you know, has been the most basic definition of my identity, you know. So, and my books all come out of that. I mean, in this novel, Quixote, just about all the main characters are immigrants of one kind or another, you know. And I think, you know, if you live in any of the great cities of the world now, if you walk down the streets of New York, the city is created by migrants. You know, there's a I forget the exact statistic, but that a large majority of the population of New York City was not born in New York. You know, and that's, I think, true of many great metropolises. You know, they become magnets. They become places where the world comes. You know, if you get in a taxi in New York, you will hear from the taxi drivers the story of the world. You know, you will hear about, you know, Azerbaijan or Belarus or Patagonia, etc. You know, they're all driving around taxis in New York. You know, so you walk down a street in New York and you hear every language of the planet going past you. You know, and the beauty of the city is that, you know, is that it's a way in which you discover that actually, yes, we can live together. You know, because actually most of the time in a city like New York, people live together perfectly well. You know, during the World Cup, you walk down Flatbush Avenue in Queens and you go past bar after bar after bar, and you hear people supporting different national teams. You know, so you go to the Brazilian bar, and then the Peruvian bar, and then the Croatian bar, and then, the English pub, and so on. And everybody's in a good mood. You know, so I think the cities like this are a proof of the power and value of migrant culture. You know, many New Yorkers will tell you that they think it's the greatest city in the world. And if it is, that's why it is. It is that because people from all over the world have come here and made it. You know?
Unfortunately, they're islands.
Yes, but I think, you know, you have to fight your fight. This is the corner I'm fighting. You know, and my books have always been, I mean, well, the early books, which were set in India and Pakistan, are less to do with migration, except, of course, there was the catastrophic migration of the partition of the subcontinent, where millions of people, maybe 1 million people died in massacres, but in Hindus massacred by Muslims, Muslims massacred by Hindus. So again, and that's at the moment that I was born, you know. So I was even born at a moment in which the phenomenon of migration had a colossal significance. And it's retained that throughout my life. And I think, you know, I would say that this is in a way the age of migration, you know, that in this last, let's say in this last half century, more people have moved across the face of the earth than in the history of the human race before that. You know, and part of that has to do with transportation. Part of it has to do with the arrival of air travel and so on, you know, and it's possible for people to move more easily than it used to be. But people moving and remaking the world by moving is the history of our time, you know, and yes, it creates fear in some people, you know, it creates hostility in some people, but this is the world, you know, it's not going to stop being like this.
Okay, I'll ask one more follow-up question to this because I really have it here, and I wanted to ask you, and sort of what you just said has opened up space for it. You have a character called Dr. Smile, Dr. Smile, who is a head of a pharmaceutical company.
Yes.
And he is, you describe him as a non-frontier guy. He doesn't like frontiers.
Yeah.
And to me, that sort of, you know, and of course you use some of the you know, references to, you know, to the opioid crisis in the U.S. and what we have like Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family and so on. But I want to ask you about this because we have a businessman who's a non-frontiers guy, and so we have transnational capital, which is one of the banes of our world, really.
Yeah.
So it's more of a political science question, but I wanted to sort of get your opinion on this. Is it possible to rein in multinational, transnational capital that, you know, hides taxes and tax havens and so on and so on and so forth, and retain that sort of openness, cultural openness, the transnational movement of people and ideas? Or are these two concepts, the economy, the economic transnational movement and the movement of people and ideas, so closely related that they cannot be uncoupled from each other?
No, I mean, it's a very good question, and it would take another hour to try and answer it, maybe. But no, I do think it's important that that these new phenomena, these gigantic corporations that span the world, and are completely anti-democratic, they're not answerable to any electorate, but only to investors. And that those are problematic things. I think we need to be more active in terms of not allowing people to form monopolies. There are laws in most Western countries anyway against monopolies, but somehow these super corporations get around those laws, and somehow includes, I think, corruption, but they do. And I think it's very important now to start reestablishing the ideas that companies can become so big that they become dangerous to democracy. And I think, we all know the companies we're talking about. We're talking about Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Amazon, and there's only about 4 or 5 of them. But they have become so colossally important that they transcend national bounds, and and they're not accountable. That's the problem. These are in a way more powerful than nation states now. And I do think that there's an issue there. And I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to have this corrupt character, who is in a way a representative of that world, is to show that this world of lowering frontiers and migration and so on has a dark side as well. And that to me is the dark side. And we need to become more conscious of it and face it. And I do think that there's now a discussion here in America about whether Facebook should be broken up, and that whether the fact that Facebook also controls Instagram and WhatsApp, gives it a domination that is unhealthy. And I mean, I kind of agree with that. I think maybe it should be broken up. And there are arguments with all these super corporations that they have become so big that they become dangerous. And what is awful is that they all present themselves as the good guys. People like Google, they're supposed to be the nice guys, but actually the way in which they behave in the world, that's not necessarily true.
Of course, as we've seen, time and time again. Okay, so I will ask you questions that I got from our listeners.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, so we have the first question. I'll just read it out.
Yeah.
It's a question on Midnight Children.
Uh-huh.
Today, almost 40 years later, some of us could reread the telepathic network of Midnight Children's Conference as a prototype of the social network groups of resistance in 21st century, or Indira Gandhi's state of emergency measures, and as something that would happen in the times of pandemic we live right now. What are your thoughts on abstract concepts like future or past, and the constantly repeating patterns with variations through the centuries?
Whoa.
And if knowing of all of this could be useful for humanity from a practical point of view, or it always comes in hindsight, i.e. too late.
That's I'm not sure what to do with that question exactly, but I don't know how useful literature is in a directly pragmatic way. It's very rare for works of literature to have immediate social utilitarian value. What I think literature does do at its best is it gives people frameworks of thought. It gives people a structure in which to see the world, which may be helpful to them, which may not be the way in which they've seen the world before. I think we all have a thing which we could call a picture of the world. All of us, I think, make for ourselves a kind of private picture of the world. We think the world is like this, whatever that picture may be. We all have one, and sometimes at times of great social change, such as the times we're living in now, those pictures of the world that we have seem to not fit anymore, or they seem to fragment, and so we're in need of pictures of the world that seem to work and fit the times in which we give us a framework in which to think, and I think literature can do that. It can do that, I mean, I was interested in the idea that the telepathic thing in Midnight's Children has some relationship with, with the internet and so on. I mean, there's another. I mean, actually, in Haroun and the Sea of Stories, the idea of the Sea of Stories, somebody wrote a kind of scholarly essay saying that I had predicted the internet, which I'm very grateful to take the credit for. But I mean, of course, I didn't, but I do think that these are ways in which novels, either just by the form of the novel or by metaphors used in the novel, it can give people ways of, give people things that help them that they can use to understand the world in which we're in. And I think that's the value. And that's as well as I can answer. It was a long, complex question, but that's a part of the answer.
I have another question actually for you, based on what you just said. I was recently talking to the British Indian novelist Rana Dasgupta.
Yes.
And what he was saying is that novelists are the ones who need to imagine the future, because politicians or people who work in the social sciences, they don't have that kind of imagination, and we need a new kind of imagination to be able to get to a new place which we cannot imagine yet.
I mean, I like his work very much, Rana Dasgupta. I think he's a very talented writer, and I agree. That's very much the way he thinks. He thinks in a way of projecting forward. I mean, I have a little worry about it, because I think whenever you read if you read what people 20 years ago thought the future was going to be like, the future wasn't like that. So it sometimes seems to me that trying to imagine the future is a way of being wrong about the future, because the future surprises us all the time. The world doesn't turn into what we think it's going to turn into. I mean, I would be willing to bet that if today we were to ask writers to predict what the world would be like in 50 years' time, that in 50 years that would seem ridiculous. I mean, if 50 years ago, only 50 years ago, nobody could have predicted the existence of the internet, the existence of smartphones, the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's a whole range of things that if you had said it to people in the year 1970, they would have thought you were insane. How could those things be? How could it be that you would have, an object like this, which can give you access to almost all the information that's available in the world? If I had talked to my father in those terms, he would have thought I was mad.
Or to talk to each other over the
yes,
like this.
Exactly. That the way the conversation that we're having would seem absurd to even imagine that. And that you can have that actually while walking down the street. You can be on the phone and see an image of your child in another country and have a chat with them. Impossible. So I think, yes, it's a great thing to imagine the future, but I feel that our imaginations are not equal to the task of imagining the future, because the future will amaze us, and it may be better than we fear. It may be better than we fear. It may be worse than we fear.
Yeah. Maybe it's always worth attempting, I guess.
Yes. No, I like that coming back to science fiction. The science fiction has been for always in the business of predicting the future. And I love a lot of the futures that they created.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, because we're running out of time, and I'm just trying to get in the questions as well. So the next question, I'm going to roughly translate it. I know that the great American novel is more of an outdated concept, but what do you think would be the characteristics of such a novel? What kind of themes and personages it should have? Well,
the closest thing I can think of in contemporary literature to the great American novel would be Saul Bellow's novel, The Adventures of Augie Marsh, which is a great big picaresque novel that tries to encompass the whole of the country. And that's one way of doing it. another way of doing, and very often the American novel at its heart has been a novel of a journey, and that begins, as Ernest Hemingway once said, that the whole of American literature comes from one book and its name is Huckleberry Finn. And that idea of taking your character and going off into the world in order to remake yourself, that's very close to the heart of the project of American literature. New York is a city that people come here to remake themselves. The Great Gatsby is a novel about about a character who tries to reinvent himself in order to win the love of a girl. So that idea of self-reinvention is somewhere at the heart of the project of America. People came here from Europe in order to reinvent themselves, and in doing so, managed to eradicate an enormous amount of the original population and invent slavery. So there are problems with it, but that idea of remaking yourself in a new world, that's very close to the heart of American literature. And I think look for those books if you want a great American novel. Try Huckleberry Finn.
Huckleberry Finn is great. One of my favorite books. You see, these are the dangers of the internet, Salman. Somebody's been looking at the books on your table. And
what, behind me?
The question is, I see A Promised Land on the table behind you. What else are you reading these days? Have you been impressed by a young writer recently?
Well, yes. I mean, the Promised Land, which is of course Obama's book, is I've only just started reading it. I mean, I do think that the thing about Obama, which is remarkable, is that he is, in fact, unlike most politicians, really quite a good writer. He really is able to write properly, and so
He's a ghostwriter?
I don't think so. I think unlike most politicians, he writes the books himself. And I think his earlier book, Dreams of My Father, is actually a very beautiful book, and so I'm looking forward to it. I'm reading actually a remarkable book by an African-American historian called Isabel Wilkerson. It's a book called The Warmth of Other Suns. And it's about this phenomenon that happened in America from about the middle of the First World War until about the 1970s, which is the thing called the Great Migration, in which tens of millions of Black Americans moved out of the South and into the North. And by doing so, transformed both the South and the North. And what she does is to take the story of three people in different generations, making that journey. And she writes as well as any novelist, so it reads like it reads, if you like a Black version of The Grapes of Wrath. But it's an absolute masterpiece. I don't know if it's translated, but The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. That's what I'm reading.
Okay, well, based on your recommendation, I'm sure a Bulgarian publisher will pick it up.
I hope so.
And let's see. Okay, let's do this last question because it's 9:15 here. What are the characters you would like to see in real life?
You mean fictional characters?
Yeah.
Well, they don't have to be people that you like, I would like to see Captain Ahab from Moby Dick.
I was going to say the same thing. I wanted to meet him.
Yeah, because he's an insane bastard, but I'd like to meet Leopold Bloom from Joyce's Ulysses. Yeah, those two would do.
Yeah.
Maybe David Copperfield. I'd like to meet David Copperfield.
Excellent. Well, Salman, thank you very much for this conversation. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. And hello, Bulgaria.
Thank you. And I have to say, actually, just the last thing, that there is a little Bulgarian connection in the book, and it has to do with the head of a cybersecurity company.
Yes.
Or part of the government agency, who is Bulgarian and whose two names, Dimitrov, and whose names come Stoichkov, Dimiter Berbatov. I guess you're a Tottenham Spurs fan, and that's where the connection comes from, right?
Well, I just made up his name from a couple of footballers. Yes.
So there is something for the footballers as well.
Yes. Yeah, and my football team, by the way, is #1 in the Premier League right now.
Let's hope they stay there.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Salman.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
That was all from us, but only for today. Thank you, Salman Rushdie and Dimiter Kenarov, for today's conversation. I want to thank the interpreters too, and we'll be with them again tomorrow during the conversations in English. You will be able to see the conversation between Dimiter Kenarov and Salman Rushdie in our YouTube channel.